So, Sylvio. This is a review I've been really thinking about for a while, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is going to be quite difficult for me to do. And I'm not entirely sure why. The thing is, I really do enjoy the game, and I really do appreciate what Sylvio does as far as a narrative game goes. But in certain respects, it's kind of tricky to review, purely because after a certain point, it ceases to be more of a game and starts to become more of an experience. And again, like if I say that, it feels like it's getting towards, like Dear Esther or Everyone's Gone to the Rapture, like those sort of just wander around and have the plot happen to you game, whereas Sylvio doesn't have that. Sylvio is a far more interactive experience. So I'm probably going to have to make this a little bit more compartmentalised, if that makes any sense. So, brief overview review for people who have not seen the Let's Play, do not know anything about Sylvio whatsoever. The 5-minute pitch is pretty much this. This is a atmospheric horror game. This is not a jump scare based horror game, this is not a gore based horror game. This is a exploration through a abandoned theme park by a young girl called Juliet Waters, who is the specialist in EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon, which is used to speak to the dead. Through the medium of recordings, seances, general exploration and puzzle solving, she is trying to get to the bottom of precisely what happened, why there is an all-encompassing fog covering the park, why people went missing, and in general, what the hell is going on. It's a very slow burning kind of experience, and chiefly that is helped by the sound production and the scoring of the game, but also by the actual design and intent of the game. It is a game intended for you to feel a certain level of dread and unease, but at the same time it's not trying to put you perpetually on edge. It is actually trying to immerse you in the experience. Now, for a game that is made in Unity, and 2015 Unity at that, you do have to expect a certain level of not looking 100%. It's a small, very, very, very small studio. But what has been achieved, I would argue, probably puts this at the top of the rankings of Unity-based horror games. I would say this is, if you like Penumbra or Amnesia or any kind of smaller indie-developed horror games which are more focused on the subconscious horror level, Sylvio has to be a game you play. It really does. I cannot recommend it enough. It is a tenner on Steam. You will get a good solid few hours entertainment out of it, and all of it will put you on bollock edge of your seat. There's I suppose another thing as well that's also very much worth mentioning in the short pitch is it's a very completionist game. You can run through the whole game and not get the whole story. You will still get a satisfying conclusion, but there is more to explore, and to the developer's credit, you can go back stage by stage to pick up all the things you've missed. You don't have to do a second run referring to the guide the whole time. You can literally just go, okay, I missed that, go back to that map, do that, job done. And I would say that's probably worth doing. That's something I'm definitely going to be doing, because I want to know the entire story here. But yeah, in a nutshell, Sylvio is a brilliant example of a low-key indie horror game that doesn't rely on the cheaper tactics that even AAA developers use. It explores a variant of horror which I think is very much underused, the acoustic and the actual use of sound in horror, over visuals and over gameplay mechanics, but at the same time doesn't lack those visuals and gameplay mechanics. In fact, it actually utilizes the limits of the Unity engine to produce something that's a lot more engaging and a lot more visceral in the way it actually interacts with the world. So that's the 5-minute elevator pitch. That's probably been a bit more than 5 minutes, but you know what I mean. So for those of you who don't want any more spoilers, fuck off now. Right, now the review proper. So, Sylvio. I suppose I should just kind of start off with the key point of the game, which is the sound design. This is a game incredibly rich and detailed in the way it layers its sound and the way it uses sound as a medium to tell the story. I mean, the whole idea behind EVP and the whole idea behind a lot of the way that Juliet interacts with the spirit world in this game is entirely down to you listening for details, listening for audio cues, really sinking yourself into the atmosphere of the world, which, one, is a great technique for getting the player interested in the game, because there is no way you cannot be passively listening unless you're listening for the details. And B, it's also just, such a new and lesser trodden path for horror games. So I have to give it tremendous levels of credit there. You have a fantastic blend of ambient natural sounds. There isn't a huge amount of it. It's mostly just whistling wind, distant birds, some creaking, some mechanical sounds. But it's layered over the top of this lovely sweeping 80s synth. Nothing too high-pitched. It's got a very John Carpenter sort of feel to it, which I think is lovely. Like, you can do an ambient synth score and it can be a little bit meh, but if you can tap into that certain, like, creeping dread that John Carpenter is very good for achieving in his scores, you've definitely touched on something fantastic. Added to that, later on in the game, it starts to actually layer in the enemy cues. I'll go touch on the actual gameplay of the game later on, but the just nice extra level of detail there of as you're ramping up the game, as you're starting to get closer to conclusion, the game starts adding the just faint staticky background noises of what an enemy would be generating just into the ambient background sound, just to make you just further and further on edge without actually ramping it up excessively or smacking you over the head with the tension at the same time. So, I mean, in regards, I mean, that's the reason why Sylvio, I mean, I think that we've said it before, is that the soundtrack is, you can pretty much buy the soundtrack to any game now, but Sylvio, I genuinely argue, is probably a soundtrack I'm gonna get, because I just want that as ambient, just writing, editing music, because that's lovely. And again, because it lends so much to the game and so much to the story, it's a genuinely useful and worthwhile addition, which I think is rare, honestly, in horror games. A lot of the time, music is there to go da na 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 na, or it's just general ambient background shagging of machinery. Silent Hill kind of got that well in like 1, 2, and 3, sort of. It kind of understood the idea of using monotonous pounding industrial sounds to kind of set a level of unease, but it was never great at ramping up the tension. That was more the ambient sound, like the radios. Sylvio somehow manages to blend all of that together, and I think execution-wise, 10 out of fucking 10 for that, to be perfectly honest with you. I am so impressed. The other side of the coin, obviously, is the looks, the actual way that the game is engaging and the way that the game actually visually appeals to you. And it's made in Unity, it's a small studio. You've got to kind of curb your expectations here, because they're not going to be utterly breathtaking. This is not going to be Crysis. This is not going to be a Resident Evil Capcom style production or anything like that. It's fairly monochrome. The textures are uninspiring. The motion is not particularly over the top. Everything looks fairly polygonal. But at the same time, I felt fairly comfortable in that world. It didn't necessarily feel like I was struggling necessarily to understand what certain things were. It's just that it was fairly low poly, and that's not always a bad thing. If other parts of the game are drawing you into it, you can forgive lower res visuals. It's the reason why Undertale is such a fantastically successful game, because its narrative and its score draw you into an otherwise like 8-bit world, which is tremendously impressive. I would argue that certain bits of it were a little bit, like, I think that was more just the design of certain things. The rust texture and some of the design of the architecture made it just look like it was kind of hammered out of old fudge, but I can't really criticise the game for that, because that's like, one texture pack could maybe have fixed that, but again, you're probably fixating on a lot more important stuff than one arsehole going, oh, the rest doesn't look particularly alright in this. So, meh, you get the general idea with that. It all fit, and I suppose the other thing as well is if you're working with low poly resolution and you're working with just generally bad graphics, it's best to stick with a fairly consistent tone for all those graphics, which Sylvio did. There was no moment where you saw like a notable drop in graphical quality. There was no sudden, oh, the map design team really fell through on this bit. Everything felt right. And there was a certain element of like nightmarish architecture that started bleeding in later on in the game, which I really appreciated as well. And all of that was still done with very rudimentary assets, but it still looked good. So, yeah, I mean, it's not fantastic, but I could definitely say it's a perfectly workable looking game. And I mean, it does the job, and it's consistently in theme with the game itself. So, aesthetically, the sound is absolutely excellent. The graphics they'll do the job, and they do at the very least show that the people developing the game understood how to create assets and how to develop a kind of scene that still produced a kind of intimidating and oppressive atmosphere, even though it wouldn't necessarily make your eyes bleed from the gorgeousness of it all. So, next up is really the gameplay, and the gameplay is pretty good. This is the one thing that I think is always a little bit interesting for me, is that I've got a personal taste and I've got to kind of step back from this, because Sylvio is actually trying to do a lot. It's just not doing a lot that I'm used to, so I can't criticise it for doing something different, because I like different. I like games trying different things. I love developers going, let's try something like this, because you've got to just reward creativity. You've got to reward people who take chances on games. Otherwise, what's the fucking point? You'll just play the same game forever. The main crux of the game are recording sounds from the afterlife via your EVP recorder, playing them back, slower, faster, to pick out all the messages in between, and also basic puzzle solving and a little bit of combat through the Spudzuka, powered by pesticide, which was a rather amusing little extra they threw in there, to just solve some basic physics-based puzzles and to combat the enemies in the game. Now, the big kind of the meat of the game is going to be the recordings, because that is not just what helps develop the game, it's also a way of actually helping you find objects, and I think revealing objects, to be perfectly honest with you. But it's also a major key point in developing the atmosphere further, because as I said before, with the audio of the game, the EVP and the splicing and decoding of the messages in the recordings is the other major player in the generation of the atmosphere and the ramping up of the tension in the game. Very early on, it's fairly rudimentary. It just eases you into it. There's nothing particularly too oppressive, although you are talking to dead people, so you know, it's slightly concerning. Although Juliet never gives a sense. I will touch on what Juliet actually is like later on as well, I swear. But it does just gradually ramp up this tension, and there is a wonderful moment later on in the game, and obviously spoilers, but this is the spoilery part of the review, where you are actually doing a recording and you're having a seance with someone, and then another spirit butts in, and it's the first time that's happened, and it's Sylvio. It's the big bad of the game, and that is such a great thing to drop on the player, and the fact that they do it in something you're already used in doing is 101 for horror, is take something every day and do something odd with it, do something unexpected and worrying and concerning with it. And the wonderful part of it is that's not the key moment where everything goes crazy. That's just oh, she's been watching the whole time. Fuck. And yeah, my reaction at the time was pretty much that. A small bit of poop came out, but it was nothing drastic. And as something that, as a way of interacting with the environment, as a way of progressing the story, but heavily involving the character, I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful game mechanic, and I really hope that the sequel, which has just come out, and I have installed on my computer while I'm saying this, follows the same path. I haven't actually looked too far into Sylvio 2 itself, but I'm very, very excited. Beyond that, and beyond the actual audio side of the gameplay, the physical puzzle solving, the combat is fine. It's nothing to write home about necessarily. You will be using blunt objects to solve puzzles, and you'll be using sharp objects to fight off the enemies. The enemies are just kind of iridescent black balls of licorice, or they are the gigantic. Okay, I will give total credit. The small black fluffy things were scary the first one or two times because it was hard to pick out where they were coming from. Obviously, phasing through architecture is kind of a bonus for those guys. Not so much for me, because I never know where they are until they actually gank me in the face. But then when we went and moved on to the gigantic avatar dudes, the huge black smoky people, who I'm now starting to suspect were the residents of the park who died, and like that's them. That was a genuine, oh Jesus, even though it was a very simple, like, that was just a human asset with a very basic particle effect around them. It was a very effective design, and yeah, definitely, definitely got me on edge again, so... but the combat itself is very much a case of find ammunition, ensure you've got enough gas in your Spudzuka in order to actually hit them, although quite to the game's credit, it's fairly liberal with not just the ammunition, but the ability for you to store ammunition in your inventory, and also for you to just find extra gas canisters knocking around. Plus, brilliant anti-frustration measure, I bet that came as like a second pass on the beta, or if someone called it first time round, kudos, a good man, the ability to have a free lineup shot, a little white tracker ball you could fire out, which cost you no pressure, no ammo, but allowed you to sight in where the next shot was going to go. to prevent people from, like me, from going and never being able to line up the shot properly, having that tremendously useful. So there's definitely, you can kind of tell there's been a lot of thought put into how to get the player from A to B in the most comfortable way possible while still maintaining the tension. You are never just wandering around feeling like you're Big Dick McGee, but you at the same time not feeling like you're bashing your head up against all sorts of kind of complicated puzzles. The puzzles that were there, and like the kind of puzzles that maybe threw me a little bit, I worked out on maybe the second try. Like the timed gate puzzle, I just did one rotation of it all, went, oh right, so that's when it triggers. Bing, 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 done. Great. So that's a lovely little puzzle, because all you really need for a puzzle is for 2 attempts. 1 attempt to discover how the puzzle works, a second attempt to solve the puzzle. If you have 5 or 6 attempts, then the player's either not working out what he needs to do, or you've made the puzzle so fine, so like logic gated, that it's going to take him a while to like brute force his way through it. So yeah, I feel like the actual puzzle design of this game, while fairly rudimentary, was still pretty good quality, very linear but clearly set out, and I appreciate that for any kind of game that decides to use puzzles and any kind of logic gating puzzles like that. So, yeah, gameplay-wise, yeah, absolutely fine. The EVP side of it, I think, was a great move forward for horror games, and I really hope that... Because, I mean, there's stuff like Fatal Frame, which uses more visual sides of the horror, but I find that sound is really not engaged enough, and Sylvio seems to be the only game that's really pushing that, so I'd love to just see more games trying to use that out. And the combat itself is, again, rudimentary, the puzzle solving, rudimentary, but clear, easy to accomplish, but still with a certain level of skill to actually overcome. So the final part of it, of course, is the story, and Sylvio's story is not coming quietly. It's it's a game where you are very much given a opportunity to discover more, and whether or not you do is pretty much down to how much legwork you feel like doing. It's not one of these where you feel like you've got to walk from pillar to post to get every single bit of knowledge you need, because I got to the end of it and I was fairly sure I knew everything, but I'd actually missed quite a few seances, quite a few extra recordings, which would have shed a bit more light on what was happening. That said, it still felt like a very complete story. The main idea is, as I said right at the beginning, is that Juliet is going into this park pretty much just to satisfy her own curiosity. And I think as a jumping off point, that's a really interesting idea. Unless I've missed something dramatic in unless I missed something dramatic in the game, which I totally missed, because I'm being completely stupid here. But Juliet does seem to just want to go in here in order to just work out what happened. There's a certain level of professional curiosity here, which again I think is very unusual for horror games. I feel like a lot of the time, I mean, I've actually done this in a couple of tabletop campaigns as well, where the party will have a "why are we here?" sort of question, where we've all come to this location for one specific reason and everything's fucked, and we're like, well, we're leaving, and that we had to find reasons to stay again. I think the fact that Juliet is just going in with no objectionable reason but she is purely going in there because she's got everything she needs, she knows what she wants to do, and she just wants to find out. You can't really argue with that, because she's showing that she's competent, she's showing that she knows what the risks are, and she's showing that she knows how to deal with them. So it's a very nice way of easing a player into this world and making them want to see more without feeling like it's a "no, thou must go and do this." It's hand-holding, but it's not pulling you. It's more like keeping you at heel, which I think is a nice way to progress the story, where you want to know more, but you're not accelerating beyond where the story wants to go, and you're not lagging behind and just waiting for the story to clunk into the next stage. I mean, honestly, there's not a huge amount to say is the only thing. A lot of it is just puzzle solving. You do, obviously, there's some certain motifs, there's the tunnel, there's the holidays, there's the small, like, ideas of what may be happening, like, around the outskirts of the park, and what may be going in and out, and what's actually driving certain things, but I never worked out the link between Sylvio and Sargent Park, whether or not that was an actual spirit that had originally been there, if that was something that was created by the lab, or what precisely, but it did just allow me to feel like I'd got to the end of the game, which was a bit of a mindfuck, to be perfectly honest. I'm very interested to see where Sylvio 2 goes with it. I do realise as well, I'm passing my hand in front of the microphone quite a lot. I'm going to stop doing that now. I'm going to have my hands on my lap like a good boy. Sorry about this. But I'm very interested to see precisely where the game actually goes with this, because I would like a little bit more resolution, and I ideally will get more resolution when I complete the game properly and go back and do all the extra things. But aside from that, that's pretty much everything. I tremendously recommend this game to anyone who's interested in horror. If you want to try something a little bit fresh, a little bit new, but you're not too concerned over the actual mechanics of the game, it's very much worth looking into. If you want something a little bit more action-orientated, a little bit something faster paced, it's maybe not for you, but again, this game goes on sale all the time. If you can find it on a sale, I say this for every game to be honest, but if you can find us on a sale, or find it on a bundle of holding, there might be a Halloween bundle coming up. If Sylvio's on there, go and get it. Just, you will not be disappointed. It is a brilliant little game. It's totally underrated, even though it actually makes a lot of top 10 lists for horror games for like the 2010s, so I'm surprised it's not better known. But anyway, thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. I know this has been very disorganised and very discombobulated, and that's mostly me just not really knowing how to get this out. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, and when we come back, we'll you know, probably do the sequel, because it's literally just come out. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.